Alrighty, welcome everybody. My name is Ken. I'm here with Linkso, and we've got Laurel Nagle today with the Master Gardeners talking about the container gardening. And Laurel, we've got 2 hours, so the class is all yours, and we'll go ahead and address questions towards the end of the class. And welcome everybody, and send in your questions via chat. Welcome.
Okay. Yes, welcome. Thank you for tuning in. I'm a master gardener, and for those of you who aren't aware, we're a volunteer organization. There is one in almost every county and across the United States that is trained in science-based information, usually through the university that does the ag research in your state. So we can offer you, really great information for whatever gardening situation you have. At the end of this, there's a place to reach out if you're in San Mateo or San Francisco, if you have questions about something. My name's Laurel Nagle. I own a container gardening business called Every Bloomin Thing. I've been doing that now for about 8 years, and we do container gardening up and down the San Francisco Peninsula quarterly, mostly the seasonal colorful stuff, but we've also done vegetable gardens, succulent gardens, indoor plants. So that's what this talk is about. The rules are basically the same for all container gardening, with some little variations. I'll try to highlight those. I do have an extra emphasis on vegetable gardening today, because this time of year, most people are thinking about planting tomatoes and basil and zucchini and everything. So, and I will stay as long as people have questions. So, don't worry about that. First of all, container gardening is really a great way to get started. You can do it almost anywhere. You don't need space or good soil. You can, move it around. You can start your summer crops sooner than plants that have to go in the ground, because the soil in containers usually warms up faster than the soil, your regular garden soil. As I said, no matter what, basically the steps are all the same. You want to know what your goals are. I'll go through all of these, what your specific environment is. There's issues with what container you pick, the soil and fertilizer, plant selection, planting technique, and then ongoing care. So the first is, what is your goal? Do you want to grow a few tomatoes, or actually provide a significant quantity of food for your family? Do you want cut flowers all the time? Do you need privacy like this bamboo is offering? Or curb appeal? There's really so many things you can do with it. And there's a few practical things you want to think about. How easy it is to get into your container. Especially if you're doing something like vegetable gardening, you want to attend to that pot fairly regularly. So if you have to move something to get to it or climb over something, that can be a little hard. You want to think about what the mature version of this plant will be, so that you have enough space when it grows up. Where's the water? Again, quantity of harvest, because if you want a lot of food, you're going to need several containers. If you just want a few tomatoes or some basil to pick, one container. And then what is the long-term care, and are you capable of providing that? The first thing, well, goal is important. That somewhat dictates everything else. But after that, you really want to know your environment. And that means you need to go where you think you're going to put these pots and see how many hours of sun and shade. And that will differ summer and winter. Right now, if you're just doing something for the summer, you can go out there figure out how sunny it is, how many hours and where, and you'll be fine. If you're putting something permanent, you kind of want to figure out summer and winter. There are apps. I know Apple has some, I don't know if they're included. I have an Android, I have a Google phone, and I downloaded Sun Surveyor. I use it all the time in my job. There's probably many others that are really good. The orientation of the sun, is it hitting you on or, you know, from a side? The wind, because that will really hurt certain plants or damage them. You might need extra support. Nearby stone or concrete is a really added benefit if you're trying to do tropical things or summer vegetables, especially if you live in a cooler area along the coast, San Francisco, just somewhere that's a little foggier, because the sun absorbs all that heat. I mean, the stone absorbs the sun's heat all day, and then all night, it keeps that area a little warmer than it normally would. And it's the warmth, the temperature of the soil that helps those plants grow. You need to think about it. You're going to have to plan for deer, raccoon, or foot traffic, like people. Might they help themselves to your flowers or vegetables just when they're perfect? Or conversely, you don't want to plant something like a great big spiky agave or cactus near where people are going, like not right at your doorbell, or, you know, right at the corner of a tight turn where people are always cutting it to walk to your door or to the garage or whatever. Again, you need to think, where's the water? If you're going to carry it, that's one thing. But if you're hoping to just grab the hose or set up kind of drip irrigation, that's another. If you're doing a balcony or a roof, you want to find out what the maximum weight is. And then you want to figure out how much what it is going to weigh. Some containers are really heavy. A bag of soil can weigh, I think, you know, wet, 25 or 30 pounds. So you really want to consider that. Then microclimate. This is a little bit more about the stone and the sun. This is a great example of what happens in everyone's microclimate. On the sunny side over here, you can see the reflected heat and the convected heat that affect these plants. So that if a plant doesn't really like that full hot sun, you could burn it. So you want to make sure you've got the right plants there. You're also going to need more water because the heat's going to cause evaporation. If you've got a wall, the far side, or the way the wind is blowing, can cause little eddies, which might blow around a very fragile kind of plant. If you're trying to do a windbreak, you're actually better off with a series of tall hedges, or even a series, one and then one, you know, separated, so that some wind comes through and it gets dispersed. It's the solid wall that causes that eddy on the other side. In fact, even a fence with a few little air gaps will decrease that kind of situation. And then of course it's going to be cooler on that side. The soil will stay more moist, that kind of thing. So the next thing, you kind of know what your environment's like. You want to make sure you have the right container. And they're made out of everything these days: wood, clay, glazed, plastic, fabric, metal. And that the composition may affect what you want to grow, may affect what you choose. For example, oh, well, not on that one. Terracotta, or like this concrete one down here, they hold in the heat. So they're really great if you're planting something that wants that warmth. On the other hand, they also can sometimes suck out a little bit of the moisture, so you may have to add a little water. Something like this metal one here in the sun gets really hot and it can burn the roots. You may want to put some kind of liner, a coconut core, that the stuff they put in hanging baskets you can buy in rolls, or styrofoam or something, just to protect the roots. These fabric ones, they're okay for some things, but they do lose water and they don't last forever. So they're kind of fun for potatoes. I know lots of people who have these sacks they get for potatoes, and you're doing it for a season and then you put it away for the year and comes back out. And that seems to work great, but I wouldn't use fabric for anything permanent. There's some other issues in addition to the terracotta and stuff holding in the heat. Black nursery pots, the ones you buy most of your plants in, if you plant in that and you put it in a sunny place, it can actually increase the soil temperature by 10 degrees. I live in a foggy area, so that's of a huge appeal to me, especially when I'm trying to grow tomatoes, zucchini, whatever. It could be a bad idea if you live in, the intense heat of somewhere in, Menlo Park, or if you're viewing this from somewhere else, the East Bay or somewhere. I don't like self-watering pots, I have to say. They hold water down at the bottom, and my experience is that roots always find that reservoir and eventually they rot. And once your roots start to rot, that rot goes straight up into your plant and kills it. The other problem is if you've got a tiny little plant and this is your container, I'm hoping you can see my hands, and the water is sitting down here in a basin, this little rooted thing is not getting water. That the water at the bottom of the basin or reservoir does not wick all the way up to the top of the soil level. It maybe goes a third of the way, a half of the way. So I don't love those. I have seen one that's used sort of by cities, these big ones, and they're putting annuals in, every quarter. They're okay, but that's not really something you're going to get into. And then there's also things like, if you have a bad back, there are tons of containers that are on wheels or of, height. They're more attractive than these white plastic ones. These are from True Foods restaurants, and they're food grade plastic, but they're just for display. They don't use those herbs. Or if you're going to have to move things around, you may want to get some little dollies like this that you can keep your pots on. Maybe you're going to move them from the sunny section in the spring to the, shady section in the midsummer, or bring them out for a party, but move them somewhere else when there isn't one, whatever. They're just really convenient. So you want to consider the final size of your plant that you're growing. There's nothing like, putting something in a small container and then the next year or 6 months later, you've got to put it in something else. There are plants that like to be root bound, but most things you want to get the container that's going to work for the long term. If you don't, you can stunt its growth. Think bonsai as a situation where they've kept the roots in a very small container. That's the extreme. But without enough root growth at the bottom, you won't get the top growth. size considerations, this is really for vegetables at the moment. For peppers, eggplant, maybe small patio tomatoes, you could use something equivalent to a 5-gallon nursery container. The roots will probably fill that up, but you probably can get through the season with that. For other tomatoes, I would get as big as you can. I've written 20-gallon nursery container. And there are a lot of inexpensive large containers, especially this time of year, all the, the Home Depot, Lowe's, all the local nurseries, they're bringing in that kind of thing now. So shop around, you can get something for not too much money. Things like herbs, carrots, beets, you can get something short, maybe long. And plants, I don't have it here, like blueberry, acid-loving plants, blueberries, camellias, azaleas, rhododendrons, they tend to have compact, wider root masses as opposed to big, deep, wide root growth. So you can go with a wide but shorter pot for those and be fine. If you're doing containers for edibles, I got this off the internet, and I hate to admit, I don't know from who. I couldn't find my source after I did it, but there's always these cute things, grow your herbs in this or that. I think you should only use containers where you know the history of them, what they were used for. Anything you buy from a retail store, a nursery or whatever, that's going to be fine. But if you don't know the history of something, I wouldn't use it. You should also probably clean it out with a 10% bleach solution to kill any old pathogens. Certain plastics can leach chemicals. Now, if you're just planting something like some cute flowers or succulents, something you're not going to consume, you can use anything. You can use an old shoe, you can use a baby buggy. I've seen everything. So this is really just for something you're gonna eat, whatever you produce. And you definitely need to get feet or some kind of elevation for your pots. On the left there, that blue pot, there'd been some rain. This wasn't even this year with all the rain. This was about 4 years ago. There was rain. About 4 or 5 days later, I happened to be walking by and I saw that there was still this white, you can just barely see it. That's about 2 inches of water that never drained from that pot. Even though it has a hole, a good sized hole, it's sitting on a bumpy surface, flagstone. For whatever reason, it had a nice tight seal down there and it didn't drain. So you want it lifted up. You can buy, there's cute feet, there's basic feet. We also use the tile you can get from the home improvement store. They come on a pad and they could be 1 by 1 or 2 by 2. For example, if it's, like a backsplash for a kitchen, we just buy the one on sale and peel those off and stick them under. Just that 1/4 of an inch is plenty, and they don't show, and it makes a big difference. I don't like saucers. They do keep that water sitting close to the roots. In those cases, you really want to have the pot elevated, so hopefully the water isn't still touching the pot. It's another situation where the roots will eventually find it and rot, and mosquitoes can lay eggs in just a 1/4 inch of water. So if you have to have a pot because you've got a really nice patio or deck and it was just redone, I would encourage getting a turkey baster. It's labor intensive and sucking it out. Or, and this is a new thing I've seen a couple clients do, they buy a hot water heater. God, I don't know what it is, like something they put on the bottom to catch water. It's like a saucer. It has a hole in it, and it's supposed to connect a tube for something with the hot water heater. They just put in a plastic tubing, clear, whatever, and then have that drain out into the yard or somewhere away from their patio. And you can get clear or white, probably black plastic, the flexible plastic to fit in there. So that's an option too. But the water's sitting there. We've pulled out plants that, nice, beautiful trees or shrubs that found that water and, rotted all the way in. Rocks should only be on the top. Likewise, there shouldn't be cut up peanut noodle, pool noodles or terracotta pieces. All of that stuff does not help drainage. It actually hurts it. Water goes down to a point, and when there's the change in surface temperature, it just sort of, not surface temperature, tension, the water goes horizontally and it just sits there. So really it's just like the roots coming down and sitting in water. You think it's drained all the way through, but it hasn't. Additionally, you've kind of cheated your plant out of more growing room. We've had rocks, even terracotta pieces, that shift over time and block the drainage holes. There's just so many problems that can happen. If you want to do you've got a big tall pot, you don't want to fill it up with everything, you can do a pot in a pot. So got a nice tall pot, you can put rocks or bricks or whatever in the bottom, and then either landscape fabric or just a smaller container that you plant your plants in and set it on top. And if you need, you can do a little Spanish moss around the edge or get some trailing plants to hide the difference. That's the only, thing I would do. Rocks on top are great for things like some natives, for succulents. They don't want their necks to be wet. So, that just keeps that top area dry. Okay, potting soil. You want to get potting soil. You don't want to dig something from the yard, mix it in. The stuff from the yard, I don't care how great it is. If nothing else, it's got probably weed seeds, pathogens, little insect or insect eggs that you aren't aware of yet. You really want to get potting soil that is blended for good drainage, for the nutrition or the organic structure that plants need. Some of them have mycorrhizal fungi. I don't think it all lives while it's sitting in a plastic bag and then in the sun and then makes it home, but it has some, and that's always really helpful because that fungi is helping the roots get more nutrition in the soil. Some versions, this was popular during the serious drought years, 2 and 3 or 4 years ago, come out with versions that have amendments like a coconut core or aloe juice, which I don't know how that works, but supposedly holds on to the moisture a little better. They're fine, they're great. I do like only organic though. Sometimes the non-organic, they can have sludge or some other things that I just don't want my plants growing in, especially if I'm doing something I might eat. There's 2 other soil blends you might need. You might need an acid planting mix. Again, for plants that, really want that thrive in that soil. So the blueberries, camellias, azaleas, there are others. You should research anything you're going to buy just to double check those specific little, things that help it thrive. For things that want acid soil, acidic soil, it's because they need that pH to be at, the right level so it can absorb nutrition. If it's not an acidic soil, you could put in lots of fertilizer, but it just can't do anything with it. It can't process it internally. Succulents and cactus, they do want to drain quickly. I don't think you have to buy cactus planting mix, but you're welcome to. If you're buying potting soil, you can buy a small bag of perlite or lava rock or something like that and mix it in 15-20% of the potting mix and you're all set. Fertilizer. This is where I think organic fertilizer is really the only thing you should use. First of all, it helps build the soil as well as the plant. It's kind of hard to burn a plant by overdoing it with the fertilizer. Not that you should just waste money and pour tons into your pot, but there's a little bit more flexibility there. You're less likely to get the super growth, the super fast growth that you might get with some of the more processed fertilizers. But that super growth often leads to weak limbs. It doesn't sort of have the great immune system. Pests can really affect it, or diseases. They just don't have the vigor, as pretty as they may look for those few moments while they've, grown out. Organic fertilizer also helps with the buildup of salts. Fertilizers, the other kind, they can leave a lot of salt behind as it's been processed and washed out in the container, and the salt stops your plants from absorbing things like calcium. And if you have ever grown tomatoes before, you know that blossom rot, which is when your tomato starts to grow and it's got that brown on the bottom. I have a picture later. One of the reasons is it couldn't absorb things like calcium. And you do need to fertilize regularly if you've got something in a container. If it's for the long term, I would actually fertilize modestly. You want to keep it healthy, but you don't want to push it to grow. If it's something just for the summer or a vegetable, that's a different story because it's got a limited time in your container. But something like a tree can get a little stressed when you're pushing it with lots of fertilizer all the time to grow and grow, but its roots can't go anywhere. So, better to encourage a slower rate with those. I've got 2 pictures of starter fertilizer, which, because we are always planting something new in a container every 3 months, I really like it. I think it helps with the transplant shock. Maybe it's got a higher percentage of humic acid, and humic acid is sort of like the Gatorade for plants. So you wouldn't use that all the time, but just the trauma of transplanting, this is a good thing to use. Otherwise, an acid mix, maybe an all-purpose mix, maybe a bud and bloom or something mix, are probably all you'll need. I mean, you'll go and you'll see 20 different options for your roses, for your palms, for your citrus. And I was told by somebody in the business that actually that's somewhat of a marketing thing. I mean, there are things in those different ones that perhaps your plant will really like, but you don't have to go out there and buy all of them. Just, get the basics and you're you're fine with that. If you find you have a problem, then you can go ask an expert what you might add. But generally, this has been a good situation for us. So you're going to finally think about what plant you're going to grow, and you're going to make some selections. For edibles, this is where you really have to think about your microclimate. If you have a mild, slightly foggy, cool summer, you probably want to grow things that have short growing seasons. So dwarf or patio versions, and they have patio tomatoes, patio zucchini, I think, or certain tomatoes will have names like San Francisco fog, or are from cold regions of the world. Those tend to be the kind of things for the cooler area. For the warmer areas, you have a greater option. You also probably want a bigger pot because you'll be growing something that's a bit more vigorous and bigger. If you really are mostly in a shady situation, no matter where you put the pot can be in the middle of a border or the middle of a garden. It can be, it's a lawn. It doesn't have to be, on your patio. But if you're stuck with mostly shade and you want something edible, you're probably looking at leafy greens, Asian greens, salads, kale. You can do a lot of herbs, but you're probably in that situation. And then you can grow literally anything. This picture has a little watermelon here, and this is not my watermelon, but I've grown a little softball size watermelon off a tomato cage, and cucumbers and squash. I tend to let them kind of go over and down the pot, but you really can do anything. So whether you want to do plants or seeds, sometimes seeds are a better option. Some varieties you can only get by seed, or some things don't really transplant that well, things like carrots and beets, or there are things that don't really like their roots messed with a lot. Beans are super easy from seed, so I've put them there, but there are a few other things that don't really love their roots teased and pulled. Things in the cucumber family, melons, squash. They all come as transplants. We all plant them, but I'll talk to you later about what you do and don't want to do. And also, if you want to grow a lot of something, it's cheaper to do it from seed. If you love sun gold tomatoes, it's cheaper to buy a pack of seeds. You start them earlier in the year than this, but you could get, 15 plants. That's much cheaper than buying 15 plants. Sometimes though, you want to use, a starter, something that somebody else, the nursery has started. It's easier than to try a bunch of different things, one of this kind of squash, one of that kind of squash, or different basil, or whatever it is you're excited about. It's also a little faster. At this point, starting tomatoes from seed, you're probably too late. Whereas you could still grow the same tomato if you get a plant. You can get, this hasn't quite taken off, but I still see them. You can get grafted varieties of tomatoes. I'm not sure if I've seen it for other vegetables, but here you've got two different kinds of tomatoes growing on the same plant. And then there's just the practicality. If you want to grow blueberries or strawberries or an artichoke, you could start from seed, but you would be waiting a long time. You're going to have much more satisfaction buying a plant. This decodes the plant tag. You get there and it says full sun. And what does that mean? Well, it means 6+ hours of direct sun. Part sun is 4 to 6. part shade is, 1.5 to 4, but it's really morning sun. It's not afternoon sun at all. Full shade's 1 to 3 hours of sun, which I think is confusing because I think full shade should mean full shade, but it wants some dappled sun. If it's somewhere where the sun doesn't really hit it, but it's right next to a patio or a wall that reflects sun all day off of it, that's good too. Chill hours, you'll find this on some fruits, no vegetables, but and some flowers like peonies. The chill hours, if it says it requires those, is the number of hours it needs to be, in a temperature of 32 to 45 degrees. So it might need 400 hours like that. It's not that it has to be 400 straight hours, but it does kind of have to be within the winter time. And that's because that's when those plants are dormant enough that they just focus on producing the fruit or the flower. If you don't get enough, you generally don't, the plant won't die, but you won't get the fruits or the flowers that you're hoping for. What you want to look for, a good distribution of roots, healthy stems, signs of new growth, proper leaf color. You want to get something that's also upright. If it should be upright, if you're buying a small tree or something, you want it to have a strong trunk, have a even growth all over. Some things can be pruned or trained, but you don't really want to start with something too far from the ideal, especially if you're a new gardener. And again, signs of new growth. You want to avoid, signs of disease or pests. You want to avoid for trees. This is called girdling. When the roots kind of go around like that, these bigger roots, what happens is they get thick and tight and they can strangle the tree eventually. You want to avoid anything that's kind of got that rotten egg smell. That means there's already rot in the root system. Or dieback, you see branches that, everything's died back halfway. That's of concern. In wondering if there's good roots or not, you can look underneath the pot, see what's coming out or not. You can sometimes squeeze the plastic. This is not in good condition, but I might squeeze the plastic and try to take a look inside. I've also been known to making a mess just with my hands, take a look. Oh, I hope you guys can see this and peek in without, I don't like do that with 15-gallon things, but with something small, I can hold my hands. Just if I'm concerned, I'm going to do that. Usually just looking at the bottom, smelling it, squeezing it. If it feels really tight, it's probably root bound. However, if you've got something in a bigger pot and it feels really loose, it's probably a smaller plant they've recently put in a bigger pot. And it's probably a perfectly healthy plant. It's not that they were wrong to do that. They needed to do that. But you have to be really careful when you take it out to plant it elsewhere, because it'll kind of have a root ball, but in that big pot, it'll have probably got some roots started somewhere else, like near the bottom. And when you take it all out, that dirt pulls it apart and you lose half your roots because it hasn't built a dense enough network to hold it. Those are just things to think about. And I'll just say here, I know what it's like to go and really want whatever it is. And the only one they have is a little wonky, or its leaves are a little, they might have some mildew, but you can't be sure, or you can be sure, but you think you're going to treat it. The thing is, well, I'm really good at killing plants. I think most people are probably really good at killing plants. So I need to start with the best I can get so that, it's harder to kill the plants. So it's, better to walk away and find something healthy than try to wrestle and bring something back to life. When you're looking for things at the nursery, you're going to start probably in June to see plants like this red pepper here. It's in what they call a quart pot. It's not a quart like we think of milk, smaller, but it's one of these pots. If it's already producing fruit, it's never going to do what you want. It's already decided that its life is short and that it needs to get some seeds out there to propagate its, the species of peppers, and that's its goal. If you put it in another pot, it will get a little bigger, you will get more production. But if this plant had been put in a bigger pot right away, it would be, 3, 4, 5 times bigger. So this is sort of the bonsai kind of thing in action. Was once it's already started to produce fruit, that's never going to grow like you want it to. So it's not a bonus thing, it's actually a bad thing. If you're going to be planting flowers, say for the season, for the summer, you need to know the plant. Annuals produce flower after flower after flower for the most part for several months. They're real workhorses. A lot of perennials might have a beautiful bloom. It might even be for a couple of months, but then they're done. Not all of them, but some of them. So when you go to pick something with flowers, you probably, the best choice is something that already has buds, but hasn't bloomed too much. You might want a few blooms. One, if you're doing something for a decoration and you really want to match the color, make sure it's the blue you think it is that will match, the blue of another plant. Or, you're having an event and you want it to look nice. For those reasons, you can go with some, but know your plant. If it's something that kind of blooms once, you want to try to get something that hasn't already started. You just get cheated out of the enjoyment of it. These are just the basics of planting. Let's see, the biggest ones: water all your plants before you start working with them. It's something that when we get busy, I'm always telling people to stop and do. It helps the plants avoid stress. And also, if you put in a plant with a very dry root ball into some potting mix that maybe even is damp, it's kind of got a little air bubble in there and will not necessarily rehydrate when you water everything. And I have a little picture of that later in general. So it's really better all around to water them. You want to carefully tilt them out. You don't want to yank on the leaves or the stem. If there's a really sturdy trunk, sure, you can, but you want to push the sides of the pot. You maybe roll it on its side if you need to. It might take 2 people, but you gently want to get it out. Loosen the roots. Now I've put gently because for a lot of things that's true. If you've got a great big bush you're putting in and it's totally root bound, then you might really need to be aggressive in loosening up those roots. But for a lot of things, that's what you want to do. You want to make sure it gets in good contact with the soil there. You don't want to push it way down, but you want to tamp it in so that it has contact all around. You don't want air pockets in your pot. If you've got air pockets, the roots aren't going to grow in that section, and it could stress it out. It could kill it. It won't be, it won't have a place just to get nutrition. Try to mix in the fertilizer as you're planting, not just on the top, so it's near the roots. Don't plant too deep. That is wherever the plant comes out. Find something. Okay. So this plant, I would not plant any deeper than it already is when I try to pull this out. So it should not be any deeper than here. That is the perfect depth for that plant. If you plant them too deep, they'll probably rot. And that's a really common reason of why plants do die, is they get in too deep, water comes around. Plants don't like water around their neck unless they are water plants. In general, they don't want water around their neck. It encourages rot in the crown and the roots. Rot just makes more rot. So it's something to avoid. You want to water well all around the pot, all around the surface of the pot, not just in one section. Make sure all the soil has settled. And ideally, when you're doing your pot, it's so common, we still do this, where you're doing the pot and you're putting the plants in, you're putting in the dirt, and all of a sudden it's at the same level as the top of the pot. Well, if you're hand watering, all that means is dirt's going to come out the sides every time you try to water. So give yourself an inch so that as you do water, if it builds up a little bit, it has a space to drain. And you really don't want to plant during a heat wave. Now, sometimes you can't help it. I mean, you bought the plants, they need to be, planted or they'll just do worse. So you have to get them in. In those cases, try to do early morning before it gets hot, and try to give them at least afternoon shade, if not all day shade. I mean, if it's really one of those crazy dramatic heat waves, I try to keep them in the shade the whole time. But with air circulation, if it's going to go on and on, like for a week, you might give it morning sun, put it back in the shade, something. It's, it gets stressed out like we do. Now, when I said do not plant too deep, there are exceptions. I mean, mostly we think about tomatoes, that it's actually beneficial to plant them deeper than they come. You take off the first few sets of leaves, not roots, plant it deeper, and that fuzzy stem of it will start to create more roots coming out. So that's good for it. There's a few other things you can do that with, but again, it's a matter of researching it or, asking a professional. These are tips learned from experience. When there's several seedlings in a 6-pack, like I've got there at the top, it doesn't mean that that's the ideal situation. It means that the grower wanted to make sure there was a plant in every one. And perhaps the grower knows from market experience that if there's 2 pea plants in every cell of the 6-pack, people are more likely to buy it than if it has, 1 in every 6-pack. So, and it's not that much more expensive for them to throw in another seed. So you get these beans, squash, melons, whatever, and they'll have 2 or 3 plants in them. You really don't want to tease those apart. Most of those things that's where they don't like their roots fuss. The things I said didn't transplant well, the beans, the melons, and whatever. If you were to just take them out of the container as is and put it in the ground, maybe gently, if it's root bound, loosen up a little bit of roots, it would be fine. it's when there's 3 of them there and you're trying to like gently tease them. And I tried this for many years, soaking it in water, and I didn't want to kill a plant. I just wasted a lot of time, and mostly they died anyway. So I would say if there's 2 plants and they both look healthy, you could try putting that grouping into a big pot and see if both will live. Otherwise, if there's 3 or more, you want to cut at the soil level the weaker ones. You don't want to pull them out, because again, that's where the roots get disturbed. But you want to cut them down. The roots will die and go back into, decompose into the soil. So that's what you want to do. You want to put in your support then, not when the thing is too big. You already know about the heat. If you want to mulch something, whether it's an ornamental or not, you don't want to put mulch around the neck of the plant. You want 4 inches at least space around it. It's about getting moisture in there, and that again encourages the rot. So you can put it all around the outside. Mulch is fine for, decoration, and actually for my vegetables to keep the moisture longer in the pots. I use alfalfa straw. I think alfalfa grass straw. You want to get something like that, or an oat grass. You don't want the seeds, so you want to make sure you can get it from like a feed store or something. Those things actually, not only do they decompose and add to the soil, but I find they hold the moisture in pretty well. You probably have to add more of it later in the season. It won't last all 3 months or 4 months, but it's an easy way to mulch, inexpensive, and it does a good job. If you're going to do something ornamental like this pot here, there's just also a few things to think about. You want to think about the sun orientation, because it's going to grow, whether it's, from here down or wherever. It doesn't hit all the way around the pot. So there will be a shady section. So sometimes you may have a lot of plants that like sun, but in the back, you might want to plant something that likes shade, because it's really going to that's all it's going to see. If you're doing something that like a seasonal planting, you can put them in pretty closely. You don't have to worry about, room to grow. They're only going to go so far. And the style of that kind of thing is for it to be lush and full. Annuals, they can handle being crammed in with lots of, flowers on top of each other. But make sure that the fertilizer and the irrigation needs are the same. It's hard to put succulents with something that also wants a lot of water, for example, or a native plant in with something that needs daily water every other day. And when you do irrigation, if you're doing drip, for example, I'll show you the kind of drip. You want it to cover the whole top. You don't just want one little bubbler in the middle that's going to go out, because for a situation like this where there's all these plants, it never reaches all those plants. Sometimes I've been to gardens where the bubbler's on one side. Well, it doesn't hit the other side. So you want to use a drip that actually covers the whole thing. So social media, I like social media. I mean, I follow a lot of other container gardeners to see what they're doing. They're mostly in the Midwest or the East Coast, and it's fun. I happen to know that what they're doing is true, but you do see a lot of fads or influencers doing things that aren't necessarily best practices. I politely got into a disagreement with a woman, she was showing a great hack of putting pool noodles cut up in the bottom of her pot, and then she was planting something, and I explained that, you know, the science behind that wasn't actually really great. Well, anyway, she got very upset with that. I shouldn't get involved with social media even nicely, but it just to know what you see is not always correct. For example, you don't see it so much, but pizza gardens and salsa gardens were a big thing for a while. And I think you still see some of this. Well, if you had a pot, this pot has 2 tomatoes, 1 pepper, you know, some, I don't know if there's 2 peppers there, but certainly herbs. That pot is for 1 tomato. So all that other stuff is going to compete. It's never going to grow big enough. And vegetables, herbs, they need some air circulation. So you're going to have disease problems. That is just a nightmare. Something like this photo up on the upper left, which is mine. So I know it's not staged, but I took a photography class by somebody who does plant photography, you know, when they're looking for the perfect advertising shot or whatever, they have sometimes grabbed a bloom from some other plant, and, you know, if you needed a few extra ranuncula to fill it in, they get them from somewhere else. So that's not an accurate representation. These down here, these are proven winners, and they have this wonderful like book that talks about all the combinations, but the stuff they're showing you is actually grown with tiny little plugs. So you've got a 4-inch plant, you've got them side by side or back and forth, whatever, and they will grow into a gorgeous mass. They have wonderful products, but a lot of the stuff you see in the ads or in their pictures were started in as 1-inch plants. So you just need to know what's realistic and what's not. Master Gardeners, our website has a lot of wonderful resources, and for edible gardening, this is a really great one. If you go to our website, the SMSF Master Gardeners UCANR EDU, on the front page, there'll be this column on the left. And if you hit edible gardening and planting calendars, and they're now in English, Spanish, and Chinese, it'll take you to the second page. And we have calendars for hot, sunny, and foggy. And they kind of define what they consider a hot area, foggy, or sunny. And then you'll get a page like this. I picked up the foggy one, which will tell you when is a good time to plant beets, either as a seed or a transplant, you know, broccoli, all these things. It does only show tomatoes in April, but I think that one is a mistake. I was looking at that. You can plant tomatoes in May in a foggy area too. But it is really helpful if you're wondering about the timing. And so it's divided a little bit with our crazy microclimates into a good time for you. It's based on a book called Golden Gate Gardening by Pam Pierce. It's a great book. It's really helpful, and you can get it at the library or certainly Amazon or a bookstore. Irrigation. Everything needs water. Even the succulents will need water. They just don't need it as often. So you can either do it by hand, which I tend to do mostly because our irrigation system is broken, but I also like it. I look at those plants every day. I know when, you know, if a problem has shown up, you know, the first aphid that shows up or cucumber beetle, all of that. You do want to try to do it in the morning, and you want to keep the water pressure low. It's the splashing when you have a high hose pressure that knocks the dirt up and can encourage some of the different diseases that you can get. But drip irrigation is super convenient. You can get drip anywhere. I really like the emitters, not the line that just has a laser slit. These emitters keep the line from getting clogged with dirt. The ones we use have an emitter every 6 inches. They're available online and a few places. They're available at Urban Farmer. There's one in San Francisco, one in Marin, and one in Richmond. They're a wonderful resource for irrigation. They have stuff on their website, tons of information. They have stuff, sometimes they have classes. I don't know if they've started classes again since the pandemic, but they will walk you through whatever you need, help you learn how to put it together. They are a great resource. And then Master Gardeners, sometimes all the Master Gardeners do classes or lectures on drip irrigation, but we like it. And we like to do it around the plants. And if I had several plants, I might do a spiral in the whole pot. If you're going to do house plants, of course, the container for house plants never drain. And I understand that, but you never know how much water is sitting in your pot. So you can't just say, well, I'll water it a little bit, because when it starts to fail, you don't know if it's too much water, too little water. It's better to try to put some, this is one case where the stone is okay down below, some stone or something, some bricks or even dense styrofoam to hold the container up, the planting container, and then put that whole thing in your decorative pot. That way, when you water, it has a place to drain. Now, ideally, you take your inside pot, you take it to the tub or to the sink and you water it and let it drain and you put it back. But if you have like a great big ficus tree or something and you're not going to do that, this is the next best thing. You want to try to be careful that you don't have a lot of water draining through. It attracts fungus gnats and it can smell. But if you do get water, you can again use the turkey baster or a rag or something to suck it up. And again, you do not want the pot sitting in water. So I've got this clear saucer here. I wouldn't want the water level to drain out to be higher than where the rocks are, because that means the bottom of the inside of the pot is also sitting in water. Indoor plants are tricky. If you don't mind having a saucer, then I would suggest getting a pot that drains and using the saucer as your guide. But otherwise, this is the next best thing. Okay, this is why, this is what happens when soil dries out, and soil is hydrophobic. It feels like it will repel the water. What happens is all those air bubbles, and there's more than just this, but get inside a root ball or even inside the organic matter in the soil, and it repels the water. It just doesn't get absorbed, or gets absorbed very slightly. So if you water something and the water just comes out right away, that doesn't mean that it's super wet. It probably means it's super dry. And the only way to know that is to put your fingers in the pot and dig down an inch. You'll know within an inch if it's dry or not. If it is, you want to give it several slow sips of water with 10 minutes in between. You might also want to take chopsticks or a finger or I don't know, any, stick, and break up the surface a little bit, poke some holes into it, and then also water so that you can get it in there. But it can take a long time. I mean, we've had big pots where it's taken us 20 minutes, or we've literally had to go, get up to our elbows because we were trying to save a lemon tree, which we did, but it took a long time. There, when irrigations are regular, you have problems. These are ones for vegetables. Tomatoes, if they get too wet, have problems. Tomatoes, if they get too dry, have problems. Sometimes it's the same problem. They're a little crazy, but you know, thirsty plants will drop their fruit, or flowers will drop their flowers. Oops, sorry. An eggplant and cucumbers can become bitter. Now, I know with cucumbers, if the water's a little irregular, but you're generally pretty good, it might only be the ends of the cucumber that are bitter. So if you're growing them and you have that experience, I'd try the middle, but yeah, that can happen. Succulents need water. I would say in the summer, weekly. I mean, people don't, and then they get dried and shriveled maybe every other week. This is a situation where the soil is dried out and the water is going to just run through, but some water is better than none. You want to do it in the morning, not really with the hot sun. If you can keep it, you know, all through it, just a quick whatever, that's great. But when it's cold or rainy, you don't need to water, or you certainly don't need to water very often. In the winter, probably starting around end of October till April, I'll have succulents in the greenhouse. I don't water at all because there's so much moisture in the air and they seem to be fine. But when it's warm, they're happier with some water. Okay. You want to know about the ongoing care for your plants. Something that's in a pot permanently, it's great if you can, well, first of all, shower it, especially shiny leafed things or thick leafed bushes. They get dust, they get something called sooty mold, which is a sticky kind of dirty thing. It's a residue partly from pests and then just partly from the stuff in the air, and that also affects the plant's health. It can't, its pores, its stoma don't open and can't breathe and whatever. So it's good to wipe them off. We'll use a damp rag. So I mean, it can be that specific if need be, but hopefully if you gave it a shower every few weeks, that would also be helpful. Rotate the pot, or you get something a little awkward. And then fertilize as your directions say. For something that's going to live in the pot long term, you're probably going to have to root prune it or put it in a bigger pot. Not every plant can be root pruned. Some that have sort of tuberous, like big fat juicy roots, you can't root prune, but you might be able to divide it into 2 plants, or you know, you might just have to put it in a bigger container. You always want to watch for pests. It's so much easier when you catch things early on than when it's covered the whole plant. And we have a helpline that can help you identify something specifically. There's also stuff on our website, and there's a link later on that can let you know, I mean, that can help you look it up yourself. And harvest your crops. If it's producing something, the goal of plants is to propagate their species. And the way they do that is they put seeds out there. And I mean, that's why flowers attract pollinators to, you know, fertilize their seeds and things, you know, you get the fruit or whatever, the seed heads. So once that plant thinks it's done enough, it quits. For something like, you know, I don't know, your tomatoes, if you never pick them, well, at some point it's going to do a bunch. It'll do a bunch, but then, you know, it's just going to say, I'm done. I don't need to make any more, and quit. Or, and speaking of that, tomatoes are, most of the ones you see are something called indeterminate, which means they'll keep going as long as the weather's good and you're taking care of it. but there are tomatoes called determinate, and they do a great big crop and then they're basically done. So you want to know that and not be surprised when you do harvest. Let me see. Resources. Okay, the first one I'm going to say is Linkso here, because they have wonderful people. They have great soils. They can help you with that. And Ken reminded me they have lots of really nice containers, and they're worth going out there to take a look. I'm sure she could send you information on them. Big, nice containers can be hard to find, and you can grow anything. I've grown cherry trees. We've at my house, I have a friend who's growing a apple tree, and you know, they're great. You can grow palm trees, whatever it is. And it's nice to have a decorative one, or maybe one that matches your house or your environment, or sets a tone. So you should check them out for that, for their soils, they have organic fertilizers. So they're a really great resource and they're very helpful. Then Master Gardeners, that's our website. And again, we have all kinds of links to things. For pests, if you want to do some research yourself, it's the Integrated Pest Management at UC Davis. Public libraries have tons of books. The Peninsula Library System is wonderful. You can request books from up and down the peninsula. Some libraries don't have big gardening collections and some have huge ones. So don't assume that whatever you've got at your local one is all that there is. And I'm a big fan of independent nurseries. They mostly have people who have worked there for decades, maybe their family, maybe not, but they tend to have at least a few experts in their group. And I've gotten really great help. I mean, I'm a master gardener and I've been gardening for 30 years, really actively, and then professionally, this business 7 years, but even longer than that. And still, you want to talk to someone, a second opinion, some advice. And I really like the independent nurseries. I like to put these, if we were in a group, I'd ask who knows which ones of these pests are good or bad, but since we aren't, I just want to point out that you can't judge a bug by its appearance, because you know, my kids used to think these guys were just ladybugs, but they're actually cucumber and squash bugs. I think actually bean too. They get all three of those. They carry disease. I mean, not only do they eat the leaves, but they will take a disease from plant to plant. So you really, if you see these guys, want to try to get rid of them. They tend to fall down when you go to grab one, just so you know, they're tricky. This is a soldier beetle and it eats aphids. So the first time I saw one of those, I thought, well, that's kind of ugly. So that must not be a beneficial insect, but actually they do a great job. This is a ladybug larva. So, I mean, that looks nothing like a ladybug to me, but they are also very big aphid consumers. They're very hungry and they're great. So, you know, learn to see what's in your garden. I think the less you try to spray with chemicals, the more it all balances out. If you have trouble with pests, like a lot of aphids, it's better to just I wear rubber gloves or gloves, gardening gloves, and maybe a gentle hose, and I kind of spray it and wipe them off. That's much better than trying to spray it with some chemical. Although there's organic things you can use, that's just easier and you're sure you got it. Or to try to catch the, you know, the beetles that are bad. So lots of advice out there. I think that's, oh, here's our last page. which has the contact information. We have a place in San Francisco and a place in Redwood City. And I don't know, I think you can go into the two, the San Francisco and the Redwood City ones now. They were closed during the pandemic. Elkis Ranch down by Half Moon Bay, unfortunately, the entrance got swept away with all the storms. So until that's temporarily closed. But we're really happy to help you with anything. And in the meantime, if you guys have any questions, I'm here to answer them.
Alrighty, thanks, Laurel. We've got a few questions here. Let's talk about sort of predators and sort of vermins and how to protect your container gardens from, you know, yeah, like squirrels or rats or deer even. What do you recommend?
Okay. So these are just sort of more my experiences. Well, you can look up some stuff on the IPM thing, but what I do is, well, I have a client who swears, and so I'm going to try this with some other clients in the fall. When we do her ornamental thing, she then puts rocks in between all the spaces where there's dirt, and you don't really see them because we plant densely, but you could do a decorative rock on the top. She said that she'd read that squirrels won't dig where there's when they can't get into the dirt. They won't just go sit on the rock and pull out the plant. She hasn't had any problems since, and she's in a bad squirrel area. And we do a few people in that area who occasionally do have problems. So it's an idea that I'm trying, but they will avoid to some degree things like garlic and cayenne. At least, you know, I don't know if that lasts forever, how often you have to repeat it, but we had a problem with squirrels pulling out primroses for some reason, especially trying to eat the yellow ones. And cayenne and garlic, the person went to Costco and got great big containers and did that. And cayenne is something you'll see, and garlic in some of these repellent sprays, but she just was a bit more aggressive. For my pots, okay, so for deer, sometimes for pots that we do and they can't be confined, fenced away from deer, besides trying to do deer resistant plants, I sometimes do like decorative sticks, willow sticks, or pussy willow, you know, pods or whatever that kind of might come out, so that they're trying to get their face in there. They're getting a face full of something unappealing. For vegetables, I use either over tomato cages or a bunch of stakes, you know, thrown up. I buy netting, and not the bird netting, but I kind of like that bridal wall, whatever you call it, the bridal netting. And I'll throw that over at night and maybe hold it with some clothespins, and then maybe take it off during the day for a while to encourage the pollinators. Usually I don't have a problem with squirrels or raccoons or whoever is eating my tomatoes and that kind of stuff until they've started to develop. So I'm not so worried about the pollinators getting in and making more. But I have found that works. It gets the sun in and the circulation. I think there's row covers if you want to go to like a garden website and get it. Those are the kinds of things. You could put metal, you could get the chicken wire, the 1/4-inch chicken wire, and just, you know, encase it. I mean, if you're growing a vegetable or a fruit, you could try to do something like that. But generally, it's the smell stuff, and everyone has their thing. I try to make physical barriers, like I said, for the decorative stuff. I'm trying to think. I can't quite think of anything else at the moment. Yeah. I mean, there's the deer repellents and stuff you spray. They're good for a while. You have to reapply them, and they're good. But also once the deer figures out that's just what it is. I have heard those automatic sprinkler systems that you see can actually be helpful for deer, maybe for squirrels and rabbits too. The thing is, it might it might have to hit your plants, so you have to build a barrier.
Alrighty, thank you for that. So we have viewers from sort of all over and all kinds of climates. What are your sort of like top list of plans for a super hot summer dry climate? Do you have your favorites? If you're growing in containers in a really, really hot area, sort of like a barren, arid area, what are your top plans?
It's hard because I must know several thousand things, and then all this it's like, are we talking permanent or ornamental? You know what I mean? Is it like it's staying in forever, or is it just staying in
I suppose more like a drought tolerant ornamentals, because I know vegetables and herbs, and they all require water, and I think they're more so suggestions for sort of like a drier climate, water conserving container plants, perhaps.
Okay, well, if we're also going water saving, I mean, things like echinacea, coneflower, which will die back in the winter, but they like the heat. Lantana like the heat. If you're in a dry, arid place, I was just in Arizona, and there's something called Texas Ranger, I think, which has this really pretty purplish flower that I like. There's some grasses, probably phormium, which comes in a lot of colors, is pretty and drought tolerant. Escallonia is drought tolerant, and that, since they plant that sometimes by parking lots with all that reflective heat, I'm going to guess they're pretty good. If you're looking for some like seasonal annuals, zinnias, profusion zinnias, I think do pretty well. Angelonia do pretty well in hot sun. There's a vinca, it's Calathea rosea, I think is the Latin name, but when you go to the store, it's vinca, and it's these little pink and cherry red and white flowers that almost look like an impatient, but they're good for the heat. If that person sends you a specific what they're looking for, I'm happy to email them back with a tighter list. But those kind of things are probably, and if you look in your area, I mean, look at usually the things that are planted in public spaces, whether it's the parks or the space between the freeways or whatever, that's the bulletproof stuff. And then you can also just look at people's yards, or take pictures. If you don't know what it is, certainly there are apps now you can find out what a plant is, or you can take it. You need to go to an independent nursery to find out what a plant is. You can't go to the big box stores, because most of the time those people don't really have a gardening background.
Alrighty, thank you for that. So there's several questions regarding container gardens and growing vegetables in containers versus growing them in ground. Say take tomatoes, for example. some people are super adamant about growing it in ground versus, you know, containers. I think it's very sort of, it's, you know, it's a preferential thing, for some folks, but is there a science behind growing, you know, high yield plants like tomatoes, in the ground versus in containers? And if so, what are some of the major differences?
So for the most part, almost anything grown in the ground produces more because it has and that's assuming the ground is healthy. You know, if you've got poor soil, then we're not talking about that. But you know, you've got a healthy situation and adequate water and all its needs. Something's going to grow in the ground better because it can get big, deep, wide roots. A container is always going to limit that, and the less roots, the less growth. Now, things like a tomato or some annuals, they're sort of hyper growers. So I don't think you're losing a lot in a pot, but again, I would get the biggest pot you can. I think you can be pretty close with a big pot. And then if you're doing the regular fertilizing, you're also helping it. That kind of helps make up for the less room to grow. And also for some people, they just don't have an option. You know, they don't have the space to, you know, if it's a pot or nothing, or they have you know, the best sun is on their patio. I mean, sometimes it's necessity or physical. You know, there are pots. It might be easier for someone to sit in a chair, work with a pot, than get down on the ground and work in the ground. But it's not such a big difference as to be not worth it. I mean, you know, also when it's in the ground, you have more pests, you have more disease, you have gophers. It's harder to protect it from the rabbits and the squirrels and the whatever. And yeah. So that's kind of the story.
Thank you. And you know, on the same note, let's talk about fertilizing needs, in ground versus pots. You know, it's a contained environment, and folks are growing, say, dwarf trees in a container, or high yielding veggies in a container. You know, they ought to need nutrients because it's in a controlled environment. So what are your suggestions for growing prolific plants?
Well, I think it is just the, you know, it's to come up with a plan and keep with it. You don't, if you're doing vegetables and you're using potting soil, you're using a potting soil, you could put a handful or two of compost in, but you don't want to load it up because then the soil gets too sticky and doesn't drain well. But then the organic fertilizer really kind of does help feed that environment as well as the plant. So that's one reason I like it. You need to repeat it as it says, and something like a tree or whatever, that's going to be a more regular, maybe quarterly schedule, or maybe 3 times a year. You don't do it maybe in the fall as it's about to go dormant, but you do it, you know, late winter, spring, and summer or something. Fertilizer does wash out, and you do kind of want to irrigate enough that there is some coming out the bottom. You don't necessarily want a lot, but you do want to know that you've gotten the whole pot. For something like a vegetable, you would probably do a dry organic for the first 2/3 of the time, and then switch to a liquid, because organic fertilizer takes a little bit of time to get fully accessible to the plant. There are a lot of great liquid ones out there. Or, you know, if you're really pushing it, you could, you know, because you're going for the gold medal or a huge crop or something, I guess you could do both. I don't know at what point you're just wasting money, but yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about companion planting in the container garden. Do you think it's beneficial, or does it take away from the main plant that you're trying to grow within the container? You know, is it sort of competing for the same nutrients within the environment, or is it beneficial?
So, you know, somebody had a new thing on companion planting, and I don't know if it's on our website or not. I didn't get to see it yet. In general, okay, you get this little tiny tomato and you're going to put it in a 20-gallon pot, which seems ridiculous. Like, it's never going to take up all that space. And what am I doing? You can do some companion planting. You can either put in, you know, like some marigolds around the edge, or a little basil, something that's not going to develop big roots. And, you know, that attracts pollinators or repels certain insects, whatever. You could try to do something like radishes, or something that's short and fast. So by the time the tomato gets big enough, those things are out of the ground. Some of that companion planting stuff is not necessarily in the pot, but maybe, you know, good next to it. And that's about either attracting beneficials or repelling. I mean, cover crops, you don't really do a cover crop in a pot. You don't need to. Now for ornamental stuff, you can plant. We have people who have all kinds of things, tree roses, God, any kind of bush you want. We're constantly putting plants around those at, you know, at the bottom level, and there's no problem with that at all. You know, we're fertilizing every time. In some ways, I think the plants that are in there long term kind of like a little bit of root pruning as we do it. Just gives them new dirt to grow into. So that's not a problem. But yeah, I have for many years tried to sneak, for example, 2 tomatoes into a 20-gallon pot, thinking, well, that'll be fine. And they never get as big. And sometimes, you know, one will get a disease and then the other has a problem or something like that. So something short is okay, or something, you know, small, like I said, like a marigold, or maybe a basil, or like a Genovese basil, not some of those Thai or West African basils, which are gorgeous. They're actually a bigger plant with a bigger root.
Alrighty. Laurel, you mentioned kind of growing in nursery pots that are sort of typical plastic black pots. And, you know, a lot of folks who do container gardening, they have very much like a decorative pot that they choose. However, some folks do grow in those nursery pots. The question here is, during summertime, do we want to shield the sides of those black pots so it doesn't get super hot and maybe even cook the soil inside, if that's even possible? Or do they have enough sort of airflow and you don't really need to cover the sides?
I think mostly they're okay, because at least here in the Bay Area, I go to the East Bay to buy plants where it's much hotter than where I live, and they're just out there in the, you know, sun with, you know, on the gravel growing most things. So I think in general that's fine. I do know that certain vegetable plants, when it gets above 90, and I think that's for anything, I mean, whether it's in the ground any kind of pot, they do slow down. They actually don't produce more the hotter it is. And in those cases, I don't know, could you throw a skirt around it or something, maybe, I don't,
Or perhaps can they put the black container in maybe a decorative pot and not
Yeah.
plant it and just like shield it from direct sort of
yeah,
hot sun?
they can absolutely do that. I was just thinking that might be heavy, but yeah, they can definitely do that, as long as the decorative pot drains.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're just doing it for a day, that's one thing, but if you're doing it for a week or whatever, but I grow mostly in black pots, and I don't live in the hottest area, but I do grow on my driveway, because it's the sunniest, hottest spot. And, with climate change, we've had some horribly hot days. So, but you could, if you've got the strength and the pot, sure.
Alrighty. Let's talk about soil here for a minute. I know there's like a million different variations of potting soil, potting mix, or whatnot. Is there one that is tried and true for you that you recommend for ornamentals, and one for perhaps growing edibles?
Okay, so, well, first of all, if you're growing in pots as opposed to raised beds, because in raised beds, the planting mix tends to be a little different, and I don't know all the reasons why, but in a pot, even a big pot, you want something that says potting soil, not planting mix, vegetable planting mix, whatever. Those tend to either be for something where there's maybe some garden soil underneath, or some other slightly different situation. I mostly use Gardener and Bloom. I have really liked that, but I have also used Greenall, EB Stone. I'm trying to think who else. Now that I have my source, I like just go there. But there are others that I think are pretty good. I don't use the ones that, I don't know that any are 100% organic, or if they're 100% organic, they're like really expensive. I think there are some out there, but these are organic and natural. And, I always try to read the bag, and I have found those to be great. I hate to, badmouth. I don't buy anything like, with a pre-mixed fertilizer. I don't buy the Miracle Grow products, despite how fabulous the advertising is. I don't buy, some of the other big box soils, because it's not really clear where the stuff comes from, and just like to be sure. I'm guessing they're fine. If you're, looking to save some money, usually like Gardener and Bloom, and probably some of the others, has a sale. There'll be certain months, and maybe it's coming up, you buy 3, get 1 free, or there's some loyalty program where you buy it from. So you kind of want to, look for that. Now I know at Linkso, you guys have a couple of mixes, and whatever they just used for the spring garden market, they said was awesome, but I don't know which blend that was.
That's a special Master Gardener blend that we put together.
Never mind. You can have.
Well, it's available. It's just the seeding mix. It's a container mix. So,
Oh, it was the seeding mix.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it's great. On the topic of soils, what are your thoughts about, in container gardens, we have some flexibilities, but it's also a bit more work, in terms of replacing soil. How often, if at all, do you recommend replacing the soil in the containers?
Okay, for vegetables, you're supposed to do it every time. Do I? Okay, that's the rule. That's what the science people will tell you. What I tend to do is if I haven't had a disease, well, first of all, vegetables and all that stuff, they're heavy feeders. So they've kind of depleted some of the soil anyway. Usually I'll take the top half out and put it in my yard somewhere, fill in a hole, a divot, or as a topsoil or cover, throw it around other things so that it's not just thrown away. If there's a disease, if you really had something that got blight or a big problem, you really want to take it all out and dispose of it. In certain situations, I think you can put it all in a black bag in the hot sun and soil sterilize it, but that's not true for everything. So that's kind of what I do, or I'd use it for, you kind of have to know what got depleted, but I might use it to plant flowers in another pot or something. So I don't throw it all away, but I do replace it about half of it.
Okay, thank you. And then for ornamentals and things like that, you can.
You know what? I tend to not replace it. If something's been in a pot for a long time, usually it needs, if we're going to do anything, it needs root pruned, or sometimes as the soil gets consumed, the plant seems to shrink down. When we're putting soil in a pot, I actually am always pushing it down pretty hard, because if I've got something permanent, I don't want 6 or 8 months or whatever from then to have it 8 inches down in the pot, and now I've got to try to lift it and bring it, or 12 inches down it, bring it back up, especially if it's something big. That's a pain. So I try to really make it dense and watered and settled before I plant, but sometimes you have to do that. And so I do add new soil. If I root prune, well, usually the whole thing practically comes out anyway, and soil gets shaken off and stuff, and then I add some soil. But if I've got something growing and the roots haven't taken over the whole pot, I just add fertilizer, unless, I don't know, it's been so many years that it's almost like, I don't know what, sand or something. You just know it's gone. But otherwise, I don't, or if there was a disease, something popped up that I really needed to clean out the thing. But I mean, I grow roses in pots and flowers and bulbs and bushes, and I don't change it per se.
Okay, thank you. We have time for like maybe one last question here. I know drainage is really important growing in containers, and a lot of people have or may have some really decorative pots with no drain holes. Do you have like a technique for them to perhaps, drill in these containers? I know it could vary, but ceramic or terracotta without drain holes.
So, okay, anything that's like heirloom or antique, I just wouldn't, because, and I won't for somebody, because I don't, that might be too painful. But yeah, we do that pretty, well, I won't say often, but we've done that. First of all, I go online, because there's always how-tos. What we do is either put like duct tape over where the hole's going to go. It's part of the vibration to keep it from vibrating too much, which causes cracks. I've also seen people use like a piece of wood and you drill through the wood and then into the pot. It's again, keeps less shaking. And you want the right drill bit. There's ones that are great, better for metal. There's ones that are better for ceramic. I wouldn't get it too hot. If you're drilling, down and pushing and it's spinning and spinning, it can get hot and that can cause a crack. So all of those things are helpful. There are places where you buy stuff. Recently, I think I was at a Summer Winds or somewhere, and I bought a pot, and they asked if I wanted the hole drilled in it, and I knew that I was going to be fine doing it, so I said no. But there may be places now that are offering that, so that was nice.
Alrighty, well, that's pretty much all the questions we had today.
Great.
Are there anything in closing that you'd like to share, Laurel, with the audience that they can take home today?
You mean words of wisdom or product or?
Sure. No words of wisdom.
Yeah, I would just say, what, first of all, just go and try it. I mean, when I first started gardening, period, if I bought 4 plants, I might kill 3, but I would go back to the nurseries where I could talk to people, or to the local community center that had, free classes, or the library or whatever. And, now I might kill 1 out of 20. I mean, in fact, I was just at the clients and we planted violas and, impatiens and all this stuff. And I'd gone back 2 weeks later to do something else. And 2 of the 4-inch violas had died. I don't know why. I mean, they just did. So it's a fun thing. Gardening is very meditative in that, I don't go out there and meditate. I actually listen to audiobooks or I focus on what I'm doing, but there's no stress because you're just working on what you're working on. You're not thinking about anything else. And it's very calming and reinvigorating, but also, you just try things. And if they die, well, then they die. But, then you go ask and try to figure out why not. And online, there's tons of information. I will say, if you're going online to look for things, some sources are better than others. Any university extension or master gardener is probably a good place, but there are like SF Gate I look at sometimes. They've had good information locally. I'm sure there are others, but get out there. I'd look for an organization more than an influencer, unless that influencer had good credentials. And there are some out there, there's a master gardener in Minnesota or something. I think the Impatient Gardener, who's a master gardener, but she talks about gardening, in her zone and her yard and stuff. But she has good credentials. So just take advantage of the information out there. And gardeners love to talk about gardening. So, if you have a neighbor or somebody who likes to do it and you have a question, just go ask them. So that's it. That's my wisdom.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Laurel. This is super informative, and this class will be uploaded on our website, of course. So thank you, everybody, for attending. And thank you again, Laurel, for this wonderful class. And
Sure.
We'll see you again for another class.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Take care, everyone.
Bye. Let's stop.